They're still following you. Widow inherits dead fiance's ranch. Discovers deadly secret. Welcome back to our channel where love blooms in the most unexpected places. Today's story will take you to the wild frontier of 1887 Colorado, where a widow's desperate search for a new beginning leads her into a deadly game of cat and mouse. When Jesper McCann stepped off that train in Colorado Springs, she thought she was meeting her mail-order groom for a fresh start. Instead, she discovered Samuel Hartwell had been dead for 6 months. But here's the twist that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The man who killed him is still walking free, and now he's set his sights on her. What Jesper uncovers about her inheritance will shock you. The silent little girl who holds the key to everything, the broken doctor who becomes her unlikely ally, and the powerful enemy who will stop at nothing to bury the truth. This is a story about second chances found family and the courage to fight for what's right when everything seems lost. So grab your coffee, hit that like button, and let's dive into the Cattle Queen's redemption. The Colorado wind carried the scent of pine and possibility as Jesper McCann stepped onto the wooden platform of Colorado Springs Station. Her black morning dress rustled against her legs, the fabric still foreign after 3 years of wearing it. At 35, she had buried enough dreams to fill a cemetery, but today felt different. Today felt like a beginning. Samuel Hartwell's letters had been her lifeline through the darkest months. His words painted pictures of rolling grasslands, mountain vistas, and a life where the past couldn't follow. After losing Thomas and little Michael to cholera in St. Louis, after the laudanum had nearly claimed her, too, Samuel's proposal had seemed like divine intervention. But the man waiting at the station wasn't Samuel. Mrs. McCann. The stranger tipped his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair and kind but weary eyes. I'm Milton Graves' attorney-at-law. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Jesper's carpetbag slipped from her fingers. The sound it made hitting the platform seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Where is Samuel? Milton's face crumpled with genuine sorrow. I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Hartwell passed away 6 months ago. Fever took him quick like. The world tilted. Jesper gripped the station post, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. 6 months. He'd been dead for 6 months, and she'd been writing to a ghost. I have his will here, Milton continued gently. He left everything to you, Mrs. McCann. The ranch, the cattle, all of it. 5,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Colorado. But why? The words scraped against her throat. We never even met. Samuel was particular about his correspondence. He said you wrote like someone who understood loss, someone who deserved a second chance. The train whistle screamed behind them, announcing its departure. Jesper watched the black smoke disappear into the vastness, carrying with it her last connection to everything familiar. There's a condition, Milton said carefully. You must live on and operate the ranch for 18 months to inherit fully. If you leave before then, the property reverts to the territory. Jesper closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw Thomas's face as the fever took him. Little Michael's hand going limp in hers. The empty bottles that had nearly killed her too. She opened her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Where is this ranch? The buggy ride to Hartwell Ranch took them through country that stole Jesper's breath. Rolling hills stretched toward snow-capped peaks dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. The air was thin and clean, so different from the smoke-choked streets of St. Louis. Samuel was well respected hereabouts, Milton said, guiding the horses along a rutted trail. Honest man in a territory where that ain't always profitable. Made him some enemies. What kind of enemies? Before Milton could answer, a small figure darted from behind a boulder. A girl maybe 12 years old with tangled brown hair and eyes like startled deer. She wore a patched dress and boots, too big for her feet. Annie, Milton called. Come here, child. The girl approached cautiously, never taking her gaze from Jesper. When she was close enough, she pulled a folded paper from her pocket and held it out. Jesper opened it to find a drawing in charcoal and colored pencil. It showed a man lying still beside a creek, his eyes closed, while a figure in dark clothes stood over him. In the corner, barely visible, was the partial image of another man watching from the trees. Who drew this? Jesper asked. Annie did, Milton said quietly. She's Samuel's daughter. Been mute since the day her father died. Won't speak to anybody. Jesper knelt to Annie's level. The girl's eyes held depths of knowledge no child should possess. You saw what happened to your father, didn't you? Annie nodded once, then pointed to the drawing and shook her head violently. Not an accident, Jesper whispered. Someone killed him. The ranch house sat in a valley between two hills, a solid structure of logs and stone that spoke of permanence and care. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, their lowing carried on the wind like a conversation Jesper couldn't quite understand. But it was the man emerging from the barn who commanded her attention. He was tall and lean with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. When he looked up and saw them approaching, his expression shifted from curiosity to something harder to read. Mrs. McCann, Milton called out, meet Daniel Thornfield. He's been helping look after things since Samuel passed. Daniel approached with the careful gait of someone who'd been hurt and learned to hide it well. His handshake was firm, his eyes the color of storm clouds. Ma'am, he said simply, I was sorry to hear about Samuel. He was a good man. Thank you. Jesper found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sorrow for someone who couldn't be more than 42. Mr. Graves tells me you have been caring for the ranch. Just the necessities. The cattle needed tending, and Annie, he glanced at the girl who had positioned herself behind Jesper like a small shadow. She needed looking after. Dr. Thornfield was our territorial governor before he became a veterinarian, Milton explained. Lost his wife in childbirth some years back. Lives up the valley with his boy. Something flickered across Daniel's face at the mention of his wife, quick as lightning, but unmistakable. Pain, guilt, regret, all the emotions Jesper knew too well. Doctor and politician, she said. Quite a combination. Former politician, Daniel corrected. These days I prefer the company of animals. They don't lie or make promises they can't keep. The bitterness in his voice was carefully controlled, but Jesper heard it anyway. Recognized it because she'd carried the same poison in her own heart. Milton cleared his throat. I should mention, Mrs. McCann, there's been some pressure to sell the ranch. Vincent Moreau's made several offers. Pressure? Daniel's voice sharpened. That's putting it kindly. Moreau's been sending his men around, making it clear that refusing his offers might be unhealthy. Who is Vincent Moreau? Territory's biggest landowner, Milton explained. Owns about half of Colorado Springs and most of the businesses. He's been buying up ranches for years, usually after their owners meet with unfortunate accidents. Annie tugged on Jesper's sleeve and pointed toward the house. She pulled out another drawing, this one showing a man in an expensive suit standing over a map, while smaller figures scattered like leaves in the wind. Vincent Moreau, Daniel said, studying the drawing. Annie's got quite an eye for detail. Inside the ranch house, Jesper discovered a home that had been loved. Samuel's presence lingered in every room. Books on ranching and history, a half-finished chess game on the kitchen table, photographs of Annie as a younger child. But it was the locked bedroom that drew her attention. Samuel's room, Milton explained. He asked that it be left untouched until you arrived. Said you'd know what to do with his thing. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, Jesper found a shrine to a man who'd clearly spent his last months thinking about the future. Letters were stacked neatly on the desk. Her letters, along with drafts of responses he'd never sent. A wedding dress hung in the wardrobe, still bearing shop tags. But it was the ledger hidden beneath loose floorboards that made her hands tremble. Page after page detailed Vincent Moreau's business dealings. Weapons shipments to Apache tribes. Territory officials receiving mysterious payments. Ranchers who'd refused Moreau's offers in the accidents that had befallen them shortly after. He knew, Jesper whispered. Samuel knew what Moreau was doing. Footsteps on the porch announced Daniel's arrival. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at the ledger, and closed the door behind him. How long has he had this? Daniel asked, examining the pages. Months by the dates. He was building a case against Moreau. And now Moreau knows it. Daniel's face was grim. That's why Samuel died, and why Moreau wants this ranch so badly. A crash from the kitchen sent them both running. They found Annie backed into a corner, her face white with terror, while two men in expensive suits helped themselves to Samuel's remaining coffee. Afternoon, the taller man said pleasantly. I'm Marcus Webb, representing Mr. Moreau's interests. You must be the new widow. Jesper stepped protectively in front of Annie. This is private property. You're trespassing. Now, Webb smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Mr. Moreau's prepared to make you a very generous offer, $50,000 cash money. More than enough for a woman alone to start fresh somewhere else. I'm not interested. Webb's companion, a scarred man with hands like ham hocks, moved closer to the kitchen counter where several knives lay within reach. Ma'am Barstow, Webb continued, this territory can be dangerous for folks who don't understand the way things work. Accidents happen. Disease strikes cattle. Sometimes whole herds just disappear. Daniel appeared behind Jesper, and she felt, rather than saw him, slide something from the kitchen drawer. I think the lady's made herself clear. Thornfield. Webb's tone grew colder. Thought you'd learned your lesson about involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. Everything concerning this ranch concerns me now. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Annie pressed closer to Jesper, and she could feel the child's rapid heartbeat against her back. Mr. Moreau will be disappointed, Webb said finally. He was hoping to conclude this business peacefully. But he's a patient man. He can wait for you to see reason. After the men left, Jesper found her hands shaking as she poured coffee for Daniel and herself. Annie sat at the kitchen table sketching frantically. What did Webb mean about learning your lesson? Daniel stared into his cup. 3 months ago, I testified against one of Moreau's men who'd been stealing cattle. The next day, my horses were poisoned. Lost all 4 of them. I'm sorry. Don't be. I knew what I was getting into. He looked up and she saw steel in his gray eyes. Question is, do you... Jesper thought of Thomas and Michael, of the laudanum bottles, of all the ways she'd already died and come back to life. I've got nothing left to lose. That's where you're wrong. Daniel nodded toward Annie, who was showing them her latest drawing. You've got everything to gain. The picture showed 3 figures standing together in front of the ranch house. A tall man, a woman in a dark dress, and a small girl between them. Above their heads, Annie had drawn a golden sun breaking through storm clouds. That night, as Jesper lay in Samuel's bed, surrounded by his letters and plans, she heard Annie moving around in the next room. When she investigated, she found the girl standing at the window staring out at the moonlit pasture. Can't sleep either, Jesper whispered. Annie shook her head and pointed outside. In the distance, barely visible against the dark hills, were the silhouettes of riders. They're watching us, Jesper realized. Annie nodded and then did something that made Jesper's heart clench. The girl reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently before leading her back to bed. As they lay together in the darkness, Jesper stroked Annie's hair and hummed a lullaby she'd once sung to Michael. The melody seemed to ease something in both of them, and slowly Annie's breathing deepened into sleep. But Jesper remained awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of distant hoofbeats circling their new life, like wolves waiting for dawn. Dawn brought the acrid smell of smoke. Jesper bolted upright in bed, Annie's warm weight still pressed against her side. Through the bedroom window, she could see orange flames licking at the far pasture, where 20 head of cattle lay motionless in the morning light. Daniel's voice carried across the yard, tight with controlled fury. Get the shovels. We need to contain this before it spreads. Jesper dressed quickly, leaving Annie to sleep a few minutes longer. Outside, she found Daniel and 2 ranch hands fighting a grass fire that had consumed nearly an acre overnight. The dead cattle lay in a neat line as if they'd simply laid down and died. Poison, Daniel said without looking up from his shovel work. Strychnine in the water trough, quick and clean. 20 head, muttered Jake, one of the hands. That's $600 easy. The other hand, a grizzled man named Pete, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Moreau's sending a message. Next time it'll be worse. By noon, they'd buried the cattle and cleared the burned ground. Jesper stood in the charred earth, her hands black with soot, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear. She'd moved beyond fear 3 years ago. This was determination. We need to test all the water sources, she told Daniel. If they poisoned one trough, they might have poisoned others. Daniel nodded, studying her face with newfound respect. You're not planning to sell? Hell no. The profanity surprised them both. Jesper had been raised as a proper lady, but proper ladies didn't survive what she'd survived. Samuel died protecting this place. I won't dishonor that. Annie appeared from the house, took one look at the devastation, and ran to Jesper. The girl wrapped her arms around Jesper's waist and held on tight as if she could keep the whole world from falling apart through will alone. It's going to be all right, Jesper murmured into Annie's hair. We're going to fight back. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Daniel taught Jesper the basics of cattle management, water system maintenance, and ranch security. She proved a quick student, her nurse's training giving her an eye for detail and a steady hand under pressure. But it was the evenings that surprised her most. After the work was done and supper cleared away, the three of them would sit on the porch while Daniel read aloud from Samuel's books. Annie would sketch occasionally, showing them her pictures while Jesper mended clothes or planned the next day's tasks. It felt like the family she'd lost and never thought she'd find again. "Your boy," Jesper said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Jake mentioned you have a son." Daniel's hand stilled on the book. "Marcus, he's 15. Where is he?" "Boarding school back east, safer there." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled. "After Sarah died, I wasn't much of a father for a while. Thought it was better if he stayed away." Jesper understood. After losing Michael, she'd avoided every child in St. Louis. The sight of them had been like salt in an open wound. "Grief makes us do foolish things," she said quietly. "What foolish things did you do?" The laudanum bottles flashed in her memory, the days that had blurred into weeks, then months. The moment she'd realized she was dying by degrees and had to choose life or surrender. "I tried to follow them," she admitted. "My husband and son. It seemed easier than staying here without them." Daniel set down the book and looked at her with understanding that needed no words. On her other side, Annie reached over and took her hand. "What changed your mind?" Daniel asked. "A letter from a stranger in Colorado who needed someone to understand loss." Jesper squeezed Annie's fingers. "Turns out Samuel saved my life before I ever met him." The moment stretched between them, full of things that couldn't yet be said. Then Annie tugged on Jesper's sleeve and showed her a new drawing. The three of them sitting exactly as they were now, with Daniel reading and Jesper mending, but in Annie's version, they were surrounded by light. "She sees things," Daniel said softly. "Always has. Samuel used to say she could see people's hearts." "What does she see in mine?" Daniel studied the drawing, then looked at Jesper with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Healing." The attack came 3 nights later. Jesper woke to the sound of splintering wood and men's voices in the yard. She grabbed Samuel's rifle from beside the bed and shook Annie awake. "Stay low," she whispered. "Don't make a sound." Through the window, she could see 4 men systematically destroying everything they could find. They'd overturned the water trough, scattered tools across the yard, and were now working on the fence posts with sledgehammers. One of them looked up at the house and moonlight caught his scarred face, Webb's companion from their previous visit. Jesper checked the rifle's load and took aim. The crack of the gunshot split the night, sending splinters flying from the fence post inches from the scarred man's head. "Next one won't be a warning," she called out. The men paused, looking between the house and their leader. The scarred man spat and gestured to the others. "We'll finish this later. Lady Moreau don't like to be kept waiting." They mounted their horses and disappeared into the darkness, but not before the scarred man turned back with a grin that promised worse to come. Annie was trembling beside her, but when Jesper looked down, she saw the girl holding a kitchen knife with both hands. "Good girl," Jesper whispered. "We protect what's ours." Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, riding hard with a rifle across his saddle. He took one look at the destruction, and his face went dark as a thundercloud. "Anyone hurt?" "We're fine, but they'll be back. Count on it." He dismounted and began examining the damage. "This was just intimidation. Next time they'll try to hurt you." "Let them try." Daniel paused in his inspection and stared at her. "You mean that?" "I've already buried everyone I loved once. I won't do it again." Jesper's voice was steady as stone. "If Moreau wants this ranch, he'll have to kill me for it. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get the chance." The next morning, Daniel arrived with supplies and a proposal that took Jesper's breath away. "Marriage," he said bluntly, setting a stack of legal papers on the kitchen table. "A partnership, not a romance. You need protection, and this ranch needs a man's name on the deed to discourage Moreau's legal challenges." Jesper stared at the papers. "And what do you get out of it?" "Purpose." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. "I've been half dead since Sarah passed. This ranch, Annie fighting Moreau, it feels like living again." Annie looked between them with bright, hopeful eyes and pushed a drawing across the table. It showed a man and woman shaking hands while a little girl watched, but this time she'd drawn rings on their fingers. "She approves," Jesper said dryly. "The marriage would be legal but temporary," Daniel continued. After Moreau's dealt with and your 18 months are up, we could dissolve it quietly. No harm done. Jesper picked up the marriage certificate, her fingers tracing the blank spaces where their names would go. A marriage of convenience to a man she barely knew. Samuel would have understood. He'd believed in practical solutions to impossible problems. One condition, she said finally. This partnership goes both ways. I help you fight Moreau, and you help me turn Annie into the woman her father wanted her to be. Daniel extended his hand. Deal. They shook on it like business partners, but when their skin touched, something passed between them that had nothing to do with contracts or convenience. The wedding took place in Milton's office 3 days later, with Pete and Jake as witnesses, and Annie holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Jesper wore her black dress, the only good one she owned, while Daniel had managed to find a clean shirt and jacket. Milton read the brief ceremony with nervous efficiency, glancing repeatedly at the windows, as if expecting Moreau's men to burst in at any moment. Do you, Daniel Thornfield, take this woman? I do. Do you, Jesper McCann, take this man? I do. Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His late wife's ring, he'd explained quietly. It was too large, but Jesper wrapped thread around the base to make it fit. You may kiss the bride. They leaned toward each other awkwardly, and Daniel's lips brushed her cheek with the gentleness of a man who'd forgotten how to be gentle. Annie clapped her hands silently, her whole face glowing with joy. Well, Milton said, blotting sweat from his forehead, that makes it legal. Mrs. Thornfield, the ranch is now protected under your husband's name. Should make Moreau think twice before trying anything too obvious. Walking out of that office as a married woman felt surreal. Jesper had thought she'd never wear a wedding ring again, never share a man's name, never trust someone enough to bind her life to theirs, even temporarily. But as Daniel helped her into the buggy and Annie settled between them, something warm unfurled in her chest. Not love, it was too soon for that. But hope, maybe. The possibility that life could surprise her with good things as well as terrible ones. So, Daniel said, as they drove back toward the ranch. What now, Mrs. Thornfield? The name sounded strange but not unpleasant. Jesper considered the question seriously. Now we make Moreau's life as difficult as he's been making ours. That evening, they began planning their counterattack. Samuel's ledger provided a roadmap to Moreau's vulnerabilities. Territorial officials who could be pressed for information, business rivals who might be willing to cooperate, and most importantly, a detailed list of Moreau's weapon shipments to Apache tribes. If we could prove he's been selling guns to hostiles, Daniel said, studying the pages, the territorial government would have to act. That's treason. How do we prove it? Catch him in the act. Annie held up a new drawing showing a line of wagons crossing a river at night, with men in dark clothes loading wooden boxes marked with X's. She's been watching, Daniel realized. Annie, how many times have you seen this? Annie held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the eastern hills. 3 times. They used the river crossing about 5 miles from here. Daniel's eyes met Jesper's across the table. If we could intercept one of those shipments, we'd have our proof. It was dangerous. It was probably foolish. But as Jesper looked at Annie's earnest face and Daniel's determined expression, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of having something worth fighting for. When's the next shipment? Annie pulled out a calendar she'd been marking and pointed to a date 3 days away. Then she drew a quick sketch of the moon, and it would be dark, perfect for their purposes. All right, Jesper said, and her voice carried the steel her late husband had fallen in love with. Let's catch ourselves some gun runners. The next 3 days passed in careful preparation. Daniel taught Jesper to shoot accurately at distance, not just the warning shots she'd fired before. She proved a natural marksman, her steady nurse's hands serving her well. They scouted the river crossing, memorizing every boulder and tree that could provide cover. Annie drew them detailed maps of the terrain, including escape routes she'd discovered during her solitary wanderings. But it was the quiet moments that stayed with Jesper, Daniel teaching Annie to communicate with hand signals. The 3 of them working together to repair fence posts damaged in the attack. Evenings when Daniel would read aloud while Jesper mended clothes and Annie sketched the oil lamp, casting a golden circle around their makeshift family. She was falling in love with this life, with these people, with the possibility of healing that she could feel taking root in her heart like wildflowers after rain. The night of the ambush, they positioned themselves among the rocks overlooking the river crossing. Annie stayed hidden in the trees with the horses ready to signal if anyone approached from behind. They didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, the creak of wagon wheels echoed across the water. 4 wagons appeared, each pulled by a team of mules and accompanied by armed riders. Even in the darkness, Jesper could make out the distinctive profile of wooden crates stacked high under canvas covers. "Wait," Daniel whispered. "Let them get into the water before we move." Harder for them to retreat. The lead wagon entered the shallow crossing water, splashing up around the wheels. In the moonlight, Jesper could see the drivers clearly now. 2 men she recognized from Moreau's previous visits to the ranch. "Now," Daniel breathed. They rose from cover together, rifles trained on the wagons below. "Territorial marshals," Daniel shouted, his voice carrying the authority of his former office. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from the wagons, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Bullets spanged off the rocks around them as Jesper and Daniel returned fire. "The lead wagon," Daniel called out. "Stop them from crossing." Jesper took careful aim at the lead mule team and squeezed the trigger. Her shot took down the lead animal and the wagon lurched sideways, blocking the crossing for the others. Chaos reigned in the river below. Men shouted orders, horses screamed, and more gunfire peppered their position. But slowly, inevitably, the smugglers realized they were trapped. "Enough," a voice called from below. "We surrender." When the smoke cleared, they had captured 2 full wagons of military rifles and ammunition, along with 3 of Moreau's men. The evidence was overwhelming, marked U.S. Army crates, bills of sale with Moreau's signature, and correspondence detailing planned deliveries to Apache war parties. "This is enough to hang him," Daniel said grimly as they secured the prisoners. "Moreau's finished." But Jesper felt no triumph, only a cold certainty that their real battle was just beginning. Men like Vincent Moreau didn't surrender quietly. They fought back with everything they had. And she was right. The retaliation came at dawn, swift and merciless. Jesper woke to the thunder of hoofbeats and the crash of splintering wood as riders smashed through the ranch gates. She grabbed Samuel's rifle and shook Annie awake, but even as she moved toward the window, she knew they were outnumbered. 12 men surrounded the house, all carrying rifles and wearing the grim expressions of professionals who'd been paid to finish a job. At their head rode Vincent Moreau himself, a man in his 50s with silver hairs and eyes like winter ice. "Mrs. Thornfield," Moreau's cultured voice carried easily across the yard. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Through the bedroom window, Jesper could see Daniel emerging from the barn, his hands raised but his face set with determination. He'd been checking on the horses when the attack began. Now he was trapped in the open. "Let's discuss this like civilized people," Moreau continued. "You return my property and perhaps we can avoid any unpleasantness." Jesper knew he was talking about more than just the captured weapons. Samuel's ledger contained enough evidence to destroy Moreau's entire operation, and now the man himself was here to retrieve it. She looked down at Annie, who was pressed against her side, trembling but silent. The girl's dark eyes were fixed on the window, watching the men who'd killed her father surround their new family. "Stay here," Jesper whispered. "No matter what happens, you stay hidden." Annie shook her head frantically and clutched at Jesper's sleeve. "I have to protect Daniel. You understand, he's family now." The words seemed to steady Annie. She nodded once, then pulled out a piece of charcoal and quickly sketched something on the wall beside the window. It showed the house with a figure escaping through the back door, followed by arrows pointing toward the hills. "Good girl," Jesper breathed. "If things go bad, you run. Get to the sheriff in town and tell him what happened." Annie nodded again, but her expression said clearly that she had no intention of abandoning Jesper. Downstairs, Jesper found the kitchen window offered a clear view of the standoff. Daniel stood 20 feet from the house, surrounded by armed men, but somehow managing to look more dangerous than any of them. "Moreau," she called through the window, "let's talk." The silver-haired man turned toward her voice with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Thornfield, how delightful to finally meet properly. I trust you're ready to be reasonable about this situation." "That depends on your definition of reasonable." "Simple enough. You return the items you stole from my wagons along with any documentation that might have come into your possession. In exchange, I'll allow you to leave this territory alive." Jesper felt a cold laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. That's generous of you considering you're the one committing treason. Treason is a matter of perspective, my dear. I prefer to think of it as entrepreneurship. And murder, what do you call that? Moreau's smile widened. Samuel Hartwell was an unfortunate casualty of business, a man who couldn't understand that some things are larger than individual conscience. The casual admission hit Jesper like a physical blow. She'd known Moreau was responsible for Samuel's death, but hearing him dismiss it so callously kindled a fire in her chest that threatened to burn her alive. You killed a good man for money. I killed an obstacle for progress. Samuel's death opened opportunities for everyone involved. Well, everyone except Samuel. One of Moreau's men chuckled at this, and Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Jesper could see the tension in every line of his body, the way a man looks when he's calculating odds and finding them wanting. Here's my counteroffer, she called out. You and your men ride away now, and I won't put a bullet in your head. The laughter that erupted from Moreau's men was harsh and dismissive, but Moreau himself studied the house with new interest. You know, Mrs. Thornfield, I've heard interesting stories about you. A nurse who lost her family to disease, who nearly followed them into the grave before finding salvation in laudanum. Tell me, are you still using? The question hit like a slap. Jesper felt her hands tremble, not from fear, but from the rage that was building in her chest like steam in a boiler. Because addiction, Moreau continued conversationally, affects judgment so severely. Makes people think they're capable of things beyond their abilities. Makes them forget that some fights simply can't be won. You son of a bitch. Language, Mrs. Thornfield. There's a child present after all. Moreau gestured toward one of his men who dismounted and began walking toward the house. The man was tall and lean, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence. In his hand, he carried a torch. Fire, Moreau explained, is such an effective tool for changing perspectives. Samuel's daughter will remember that, won't you? Annie, watching her home burn, tends to loosen a child's tongue remarkably quickly. That's when Jesper understood. This wasn't just about the weapons or the ledger. Moreau suspected Annie had seen something the night her father died, something that could tie him directly to the murder. He wanted the girl to remember to tell him what she'd witnessed so he could eliminate any remaining threats. The man with the torch was almost to the porch when Daniel made his move. He dove sideways, rolling behind the water trough as gunfire erupted around him. At the same moment, Jesper smashed the kitchen window with her rifle butt and began shooting. Her first shot took the torchbearer in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the flaming brand flying harmlessly into the dirt. Her second shot scattered the men nearest to Daniel, giving him the chance to reach cover behind the barn. Kill them all! Moreau roared, his cultured facade finally cracking. Burn everything! The battle that followed was fierce and desperate. Jesper fought from the house while Daniel used the barn and outbuildings for cover, their combined fire keeping Moreau's men from advancing. But they were outnumbered 6-1 and ammunition wouldn't last forever. It was Annie who turned the tide. The first explosion came from the eastern pasture, a geyser of flame and smoke that sent 3 of Moreau's horses bolting in terror. The second erupted near the creek, and the third destroyed a section of fence near the road. Moreau's men spun around in confusion, thinking they were under attack from multiple directions. In the chaos, Daniel managed to slip closer to the house, and together he and Jesper concentrated their fire on the remaining riders. What the hell was that? One of Moreau's men shouted. Through the smoke and confusion, Jesper saw a small figure moving through the shadows behind the barn. Annie had remembered something from her father's medical supplies, a cache of chemicals used for treating hoof rot and fence preservation. In the right combinations, they made excellent improvised explosives. She's fighting back, Jesper whispered, pride and terror warring in her chest. She's fighting for her family. The fourth explosion was the largest yet, and this one sent 2 of Moreau's men diving for cover as their horses reared and screamed. In the resulting chaos, Daniel made his final move. He charged from behind the barn with Annie's chemical concoctions in each hand, hurling them at the clustered riders with deadly accuracy. The explosions scattered horses and men like leaves in a windstorm, leaving only Moreau and 2 others still mounted. Enough, the silver-haired man screamed. I'll kill the girl myself. He spurred his horse toward the house, pistol raised, his face twisted with rage and desperation. But as he reached the porch steps, a rifle shot cracked from the upstairs window. Moreau's horse stumbled and fell, throwing its rider hard against the wooden steps. When the dust settled, Vincent Moreau lay motionless in the dirt, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Annie appeared in the doorway, Samuel's hunting rifle still smoking in her small hands. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes burned with the fierce, protective love of a daughter defending her new family. For a moment, the yard was silent, except for the groaning of wounded men and the whickering of frightened horses. Then Daniel stepped into the open, his own rifle trained on Moreau's remaining men. "It's over," he said simply. "Drop your weapons and ride out or join your boss in the dirt." The survivors didn't need to be told twice. They gathered their wounded and departed at full gallop, leaving behind only the smell of gunpowder and the body of the man who'd terrorized the territory for years. Annie dropped the rifle and ran to Jesper, who caught her in a fierce embrace that threatened to crush them both. Daniel joined them a moment later, his arms encircling them both, and for the first time since the attack began, Jesper allowed herself to believe they'd actually won. "Is it really over?" she whispered. Daniel looked down at Moreau's still form and nodded slowly. "It's over." 3 months later, Jesper stood on the porch of the ranch house and watched Annie play with a litter of puppies Daniel had brought from town. The girl had found her voice again in the weeks following Moreau's death, though she still preferred to express herself through art more often than words. The ledger had been turned over to territorial authorities, and the resulting investigation had swept away most of Moreau's corrupt network. The ranch was thriving under Daniel's expert care and Jesper's determined management. Most importantly, they'd become a real family, not the temporary arrangement they'd originally planned. "Mrs. Thornfield," Milton approached from his bogey carrying an official-looking envelope. "This came from the territorial capital. About your inheritance." Jesper opened the letter with hands that only trembled slightly. Inside was a deed declaring her the full legal owner of the ranch, along with a note from the territorial governor commending her service in exposing the weapons smuggling operation. "It's done," she said softly. "The ranch is ours." Daniel looked up from where he was examining a horse's hoof. "Ours. If you want it to be. The marriage was supposed to be temporary, but—" She gestured at Annie, at the thriving ranch, at the life they'd built together. "Some things grow into more than you plan." Daniel straightened slowly, his gray eyes searching her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Daniel Thornfield. I love Annie. I love this life we've built from grief and stubbornness and the courage to fight for what matters." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he crossed the yard in 3 quick strides and kissed her with all the passion their careful partnership had been hiding. When they finally broke apart, Annie was applauding silently from the steps, her face bright with joy. In her lap sat a new drawing, the 3 of them standing in front of the ranch house, but this time the rings on their fingers were surrounded by hearts. "So," Daniel said, his forehead still resting against hers, "what do we do now?" Jesper looked at the ranch spread out before them, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, at Annie playing with her puppies in the afternoon sun. The past would always be with them, or no? Thomas and Michael, Sarah, and the son Daniel had sent away, Samuel, and all the dreams that had died with him. But the future was theirs to write. "Now," she said, taking his hand and squeezing tight, "we live." 5 years later, the Thornfield Ranch was known throughout Colorado as a sanctuary for families who'd lost everything and needed a place to heal. Daniel's son Marcus had returned from boarding school to help run the operation, and Annie had grown into a young woman whose artwork was displayed in galleries as far away as Denver. Jesper and Daniel's own children, these twin boys named Samuel and Thomas, played in the same yard where their parents had once fought for their lives. The ranch house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and the steady stream of people who came seeking refuge. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Jesper and Daniel would sit on the porch and remember how far they'd traveled from the broken people they'd once been. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of the loved ones they'd lost, and the pain that had nearly destroyed them. But mostly they talked about tomorrow, about the future they were building one day at a time. Annie, now 17, and preparing to attend art school in the East, had painted a mural on the side of the barn that told the story of their family. It showed their first meeting, the battle with Moreau, their wedding, the children being born. But the final panel showed something that hadn't happened yet. An elderly couple sitting together on the porch, surrounded by grandchildren, while the sun set behind mountains that would outlast them all. Do you think it will really be like that? Jesper asked one evening, studying the mural by lamplight. Daniel followed her gaze to Annie's vision of their future and smiled. I think, he said, pulling her closer, that some stories deserve happy endings. Above them, stars wheeled across the Colorado sky, bearing witness to the truth that love could grow from the darkest soil, that families could be forged from strangers' hearts, and that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was simply to live fully, fearlessly, and with gratitude for every precious day. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the Colorado frontier, where Jesper McCann discovered that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't land or money, but the courage to fight for love. Her story reminds us that healing is possible, that families can be born from the ashes of loss, and that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. If this tale of frontier justice and hard-won happiness touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more Western romance adventures. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have had the courage to face down Vincent Moreau? Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of love conquering all odds in the untamed American West. Until next time, keep believing in second chances and the power of found family.